The private jet touched down at midnight, its wheels kissing the runway with barely a whisper. Theodore Blackwood stepped onto the tarmac, his tall frame silhouetted against the terminal lights. 6 weeks abroad had aged him, carved new lines around his eyes that spoke of endless negotiations and sleepless nights. In his hand, he clutched a velvet box containing a music box he had found in Vienna, the kind that played gentle lullabies when opened. It was perfect for Violet. His daughter's face floated in his mind as the car wound through empty streets toward the estate. Violet, with her wild curls and gap-toothed smile, who collected butterflies in jars and refused to eat anything green. Theodore smiled despite his exhaustion. She would be asleep now, her small form curled beneath blankets decorated with stars. Tomorrow morning, he would wake her with the music box, watch her eyes light up like candles. The mansion rose before him, its windows glowing amber against the darkness. Theodore paid the driver and approached the entrance, keys already in hand. Something felt different. The house was too quiet, lacking the gentle hum of life. He remembered. He pushed open the door. A sound stopped him cold. A scream, high-pitched and desperate, cut through the silence like broken glass. Theodore dropped his briefcase, the music box tumbling forgotten onto the marble floor. His feet carried him toward the kitchen before his mind could catch up. Heart hammering against his ribs, he burst through the doorway and the world tilted. Violet knelt on the kitchen floor, her small body hunched over like a wounded bird. Garbage covered her, wilted lettuce leaves tangled in her hair, coffee grounds staining her nightgown. Her hands pressed against her head as if trying to hold herself together. Above her stood Helena, Theodore's wife of 8 months, her manicured fingers still gripping an overturned trash bin. The woman Theodore had married wore an expression he had never seen before. Her face was twisted, lips curled in contempt, eyes blazing with something that made his blood run cold. This was not the gentle woman who had promised to love his daughter as her own. Violet's voice broke through his shock, a child's plea that shattered something deep in his chest. "Please, Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Please don't be angry." The words were gasped between sobs, her shoulders shaking violently. Theodore saw tears streaming down her face, mixing with the filth that covered her. His daughter, his precious girl, was begging for mercy in her own home. He moved without thinking, crossing the distance in 3 strides. His hands wrapped around Violet, lifting her from the floor and pulling her against his chest. She felt impossibly light, all bones and trembling fear. When had she gotten so thin? "What have you done?" His voice came out low and dangerous, each word edged with steel. "What have you done to my daughter?" Helena's transformation was instant. The contempt melted, replaced by wide eyes brimming with false tears. Her voice became a whimper, hands fluttering to her chest in a gesture of wounded innocence. "Theodore, thank God you're home. I've been trying so hard with her, but she's impossible. She threw away perfectly good food, wasted everything. I only wanted to teach her not to be wasteful. Children need discipline, you know that." Theodore stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time. Every gentle smile, every tender word she had spoken about Violet played back in his mind, now revealed as performance. How long had this been happening? How many nights had his daughter cried herself to sleep while he negotiated contracts half a world away? Violet pressed against him, her body rigid with fear. She did not relax into his embrace as she once had. Instead, she seemed to be bracing for something, waiting for him to push her away or take Helena's side. The realization felt like swallowing broken glass. He looked down and saw marks on her wrists, purple bruises in the shape of fingers. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "Get out," he said quietly. Helena blinked, confusion crossing her features. "What? Get out of this kitchen. Get out of my sight. We will talk later, but right now, I need you to leave before I say something I cannot take back." Helena opened her mouth to protest, but something in Theodore's eyes must have warned her. She set down the trash bin with exaggerated care, dabbed at her dry eyes with a handkerchief, and retreated from the room. Her footsteps faded up the staircase. Theodore carried Violet to the bathroom, setting her gently on the closed toilet seat. He ran warm water, found clean towels, and began carefully removing the garbage from her hair. She sat motionless, staring at nothing. When he touched a particularly nasty bruise on her arm, she flinched, but made no sound. "Violet," he whispered, kneeling before her so their eyes were level. "I need you to tell me the truth. How long has this been happening?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes made him want to weep. Fear, yes, but also resignation. The look of someone who had learned not to hope. "Since you left," she whispered. "But it's okay, Daddy. I deserved it. I'm bad." Theodore pulled her close, feeling her tiny heart beating against his chest like a trapped bird. His own daughter believed she deserved abuse. The weight of his failure crushed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "No," he said firmly, voice breaking. "You are not bad. You are perfect. And I promise you, sweetheart, no one will ever hurt you again." But even as he made the promise, Theodore knew the road ahead would be far darker than he imagined. Morning light filtered through the curtains of Violet's bedroom, casting soft patterns across the walls. Theodore had not slept. He sat in a chair beside his daughter's bed, watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest as if it were precious currency. She had finally fallen asleep near dawn, exhausted from crying, her small hand still clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother. At 8 o'clock, Theodore's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He stepped into the hallway before answering. "Mr. Blackwood? This is Rebecca Hayes. I'm Violet's teacher at Greenwood Elementary. I apologize for calling so early, but I need to speak with you urgently about your daughter." Theodore's grip tightened on the phone. "What's happened?" There was a pause, then Rebecca's voice came through, careful but firm. "Mr. Blackwood, Violet has been coming to school in concerning condition. She falls asleep at her desk almost daily. Last week, I found her in the schoolyard taking food from the trash bins. When I approached her, she became frightened and ran away. I've tried calling your home multiple times, but I was told you were traveling and that Violet was perfectly fine." The hallway seemed to tilt. Theodore leaned against the wall, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I just returned last night. I had no idea. Can you tell me anything else? The other children have been teasing her. They call her names. Yesterday I heard them say she smells like garbage. Mr. Blackwood, I believe something is very wrong in your home. As a mandated reporter, I need to understand what's happening. I'm addressing it," Theodore said, his voice hard. "Thank you for calling. I'll be bringing Violet to school myself from now on, and I'd like to meet with you this afternoon if possible." They arranged a time. When Theodore hung up, he found James standing at the end of the hallway. The butler had worked for the Blackwood family for 18 years, a dignified man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that now held unmistakable distress. "Sir, may I have a word?" Theodore nodded, and they moved to his study. James closed the door carefully before speaking. "I should have come to you sooner. I wanted to call you abroad, but Mrs. Helena made it clear that if I interfered, I would lose my position. I convinced myself that I was protecting my family, that I needed this job. But after last night, I cannot remain silent." Theodore's hands clenched into fists. "Tell me everything." What followed made Theodore's blood run cold. James described weeks of systematic cruelty. Helena would send Violet to bed without dinner, claiming the child had misbehaved. She forced Violet to scrub floors until her hands bled, to weed the entire garden in the hot sun without water, to sort through garbage as punishment for the smallest infractions. When Violet cried, Helena would lock her in the basement storage room for hours. "She told Miss Violet that you didn't love her anymore," James said, his voice breaking. "That you had left because Violet was too much trouble. She said if Violet told you anything, you would send her away to an orphanage." The child believed every word. Theodore's vision blurred with rage. "Why didn't you stop it?" "I tried, sir. Once, I intervened when Mrs. Helena was forcing Violet to stand in the corner for 3 hours without moving. She threatened to accuse me of inappropriate behavior with the child. She said no one would believe an old butler over the lady of the house. I was afraid, and I am deeply ashamed." Theodore looked at the man who had served his family with loyalty for nearly 2 decades. "You're not at fault, James. I am. I should have been here. I should have known. That afternoon, Theodore drove Violet to school himself. She sat in the back seat, silent and small, watching the world pass by the window. When they arrived, Rebecca Hayes was waiting by the entrance. She was a young woman with warm brown eyes and an expression that made Theodore believe she genuinely cared about her students. They spoke in her classroom. While Violet sat in the library with the school counselor, Rebecca pulled out a folder containing drawings Violet had made during art class. The images were disturbing in their simplicity. A small figure alone in darkness. A woman with sharp teeth and red eyes. A girl behind bars. She draws these repeatedly, Rebecca explained. When I asked her about them, she said they were just pictures. But Mr. Blackwood, children don't create images like these unless something is terribly wrong. Rebecca also showed him journal entries from a class assignment where students wrote about their daily lives. Violet's entries were brief and heartbreaking. I was hungry today, but there was no food. Mom says I'm worthless. I wish Daddy would come home, but he won't because I'm bad. Theodore had to step outside. He stood in the hallway, hands braced against the wall, fighting to breathe. The daughter he had left behind was happy and healthy. The daughter who existed now was broken, and he had allowed it to happen. When he returned, Rebecca was waiting with tissues and quiet understanding. What will you do? Whatever it takes to protect her, Theodore said. Starting now. That evening, Theodore confronted Helena in the drawing room. He had sent Violet to stay with James's wife in the guest quarters, ensuring she would not overhear what was about to happen. Helena sat on the sofa, her posture perfect, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked every bit the elegant socialite who had charmed him at a charity gala 10 months ago. How had he been so blind? We need to talk about Violet, Theodore began. Helena sighed dramatically. Theodore, I know you're upset about last night, but you have to understand how difficult she makes things. The child is manipulative. She deliberately provokes me, then plays the victim when I try to maintain order in this house. James told me everything. Helena's expression flickered for just a moment before smoothing back into practiced innocence. James is an old man who has grown confused. He coddles Violet, which is exactly why she's so spoiled. Theodore set his phone on the table between them and pressed play. Helena's voice filled the room, captured by the security system Theodore had checked that morning. You're nothing but a burden. Your father only keeps you around out of obligation. If you tell him anything, he'll know what a horrible child you are and send you away. The color drained from Helena's face. Theodore stopped the recording. I reviewed every camera in this house, he said quietly. I've seen everything. The locked rooms, the withheld meals, the verbal abuse. I have enough evidence to bury you in criminal charges that will ensure you never see daylight again. Helena stood abruptly, her mask finally cracking. You think you're so noble? You abandoned that brat for weeks at a time. I had to deal with her constant whining, her neediness. She reminded me every single day that I would never be her real mother, that I was just a replacement. She's 8 years old. She's a manipulative little pest who has wrapped you around her finger. But fine, Theodore. If you want to choose her over me, go ahead. Just remember, when your business partners learn about this scandal, when the press gets hold of the story of the poor neglected rich girl, your precious company will suffer. Theodore smiled, and it was not a kind expression. You're welcome to try. My lawyers are already preparing a case. By this time tomorrow, there will be a restraining order preventing you from coming within 500 feet of my daughter. You'll leave this house tonight with whatever you can carry. Everything else stays, including the jewelry and the credit cards. Sign the divorce papers my attorney will deliver tomorrow, or face prosecution. Your choice. Helena's face twisted with fury. She grabbed her glass and hurled it at Theodore. It shattered against the wall behind him, wine spattering across expensive wallpaper. She stormed from the room, her heels clicking like gunshots. 2 hours later, she was gone. Theodore found Violet curled up in the guest room, her rabbit clutched tight. When she saw him, she sat up quickly, fear flashing across her face. Am I going away now? Theodore crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, taking her small hands in his. No, sweetheart. You're never going away. Helena is gone. She will never hurt you again. You're safe now. I promise you're safe." Violet stared at him, searching his face for the truth. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. Theodore held her as she cried, feeling the weight of every mistake he had made. But this was only the beginning. Theodore did not yet know that the darkness surrounding his daughter went deeper than Helena's cruelty. Someone else had been pulling strings from the shadows, and that person was much closer than he could have imagined. The following week passed in careful reconstruction. Theodore canceled all business trips, rearranged his schedule to work from home, and spent every possible moment with Violet. They ate breakfast together. He drove her to school. They worked on homework side by side. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to relax around him. Her smiles came more easily. She started talking again in more than whispered fragments, but Theodore could not shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. Helena had been cruel, yes, but her parting words haunted him. When your business partners learn about this scandal, when the press gets hold of the story, it felt less like a threat and more like a promise, as if she knew something he did not. On Thursday morning, his cousin Damien arrived unannounced. They had grown up together, more like brothers than cousins, and Damien now served as the company's chief financial officer. He was handsome and charismatic, the kind of man who could convince anyone of anything with his easy smile and silver tongue. "Theodore," Damien said, pulling him into a hug. "I came as soon as I heard about Helena. I'm so sorry, brother. What a nightmare this must have been." They sat in the study while Violet was at school. Damien listened with apparent concern as Theodore explained the situation, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "I never trusted that woman," Damien said. "There was always something off about her." "But Theodore, you need to think strategically. Now, this kind of scandal could damage the company. Competitors will use it against us. Shareholders might panic. We need to control the narrative before it controls us." Theodore frowned. "My priority is Violet's well-being, not public relations." Of course, Damien said smoothly. "But the company is Violet's future too. If we lose investor confidence, if stock prices drop, that affects her inheritance. Let me handle the business side while you focus on your daughter. That's what family does." Something in Damien's tone made Theodore uneasy, but he could not identify why. His cousin had always been supportive, always looked out for the family's interests. Still, after Helena's betrayal, Theodore found himself questioning everything. That afternoon, Theodore received a call from Oliver Chen, the family's longtime attorney. Oliver's voice carried unusual tension. "Theodore, I need you to come to my office immediately. Don't tell anyone where you're going." An hour later, Theodore sat across from Oliver, who slid a folder across the desk. Inside were financial documents, emails, and photographs that made Theodore's world tilt dangerously. "I was conducting routine audits when I found irregularities," Oliver explained. "Someone has been embezzling from the company for nearly 2 years. Small amounts at first, then increasingly large sums. The transactions were sophisticated, designed to look legitimate, but they all trace back to offshore accounts." Theodore's hands trembled as he flipped through the evidence. "Who?" Oliver pulled out another document. "The accounts are registered to a shell corporation. It took some digging, but I found the real owner." He slid a photograph across the desk. Theodore stared at Damien's face. The betrayal hit harder than Helena's, because Theodore had never suspected. Damien was family. They had built the company together after Theodore's father died. How long had his cousin been stealing from him? "There's more," Oliver said grimly. "I found emails between Damien and Helena. They were communicating months before you married her. Theodore thinks she was planted. The entire relationship was orchestrated." The folder contained printed emails that confirmed Oliver's theory. Messages between Damien and Helena discussing how to isolate Violet from Theodore, how to make him so consumed with work that he would not notice what was happening at home. The plan was clear: break Theodore emotionally, damage his reputation, and position Damien to take control of the company when the board lost faith in Theodore's leadership. One email made Theodore's blood run cold. "The girl is the weak point. If we make him believe he's failed her completely, he'll fall apart. Broken men make mistakes. Mistakes we can exploit. Theodore set the email down with shaking hands. They used my daughter as a weapon. I've already contacted the authorities, Oliver said. But, Theodore, you need to be prepared. When this goes public, Damien will fight back. He has allies on the board. People who believe he's the company's future. This will get ugly. Theodore stood, his jaw set with determination. Let it. I've spent too long trying to protect appearances while the people I loved suffered. Not anymore. That evening, Theodore sat Violet down and explained, in gentle terms, that some difficult things would happen soon. People would ask questions. There might be news stories. But through all of it, she needed to remember that none of it was her fault, and that he would always be there to protect her. Violet listened solemnly, then asked the question that broke his heart. Is Uncle Damien bad like Mom Helena? Theodore pulled her close. Yes, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I know you liked him. I didn't, Violet whispered. He scared me. His smile never reached his eyes. Theodore kissed the top of her head, marveling at his daughter's wisdom. Children saw truth that adults often missed. The next morning, Theodore called an emergency board meeting. 14 executives and major shareholders gathered in the conference room, confusion and concern evident on their faces. Damien sat near the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. Theodore stood and laid out everything. The embezzlement, the conspiracy with Helena, the deliberate sabotage of his family. Oliver distributed copies of the evidence to everyone present. The room erupted in shock and anger. Damien's mask finally slipped. This is absurd, he shouted. Theodore has been unstable since his divorce. He's fabricating evidence to shift blame for his own failures as a father and businessman. Then explain these offshore accounts, Oliver said calmly, pointing to specific documents. Explain these emails. Explain why Helena received payments from you before and during her marriage to Theodore. Damien's face flushed red. I helped her financially because she asked. There's no crime in that. There is when it's part of a conspiracy to commit fraud and abuse, Oliver countered. The room descended into chaos. Some board members demanded Damien's immediate resignation. Others, his allies, called for more investigation before rushing to judgment. Theodore watched his cousin carefully. Damien was cornered, and cornered people were dangerous. The meeting ended with Damien suspended pending a full investigation. As people filed out, Damien approached Theodore, his expression cold. You'll regret this, he said quietly. You have no idea what I'm capable of. I know exactly what you're capable of, Theodore replied. You terrorized an 8-year-old child to steal money. You're pathetic. Damien's smile was ice. You think this is over? I have friends, Theodore. People who owe me favors. You might have evidence, but I have influence. And Violet, that damaged little girl of yours? She'll make the perfect witness to show how unstable you've become. Maybe she'll even testify that you're the abusive parent. Children are so easy to manipulate. Theodore's fist connected with Damien's jaw before he consciously decided to throw the punch. Damien staggered back, hand to his bleeding mouth, and laughed. Perfect. Now, you've assaulted me in front of witnesses. This just keeps getting better. Security escorted Damien from the building. Theodore stood alone in the conference room, shaking with adrenaline and fury. Oliver appeared beside him. He'll come after Violet, Theodore said. He'll try to use her to destroy me. Then we protect her, Oliver replied. And we gather every piece of evidence we can. The truth is on our side, Theodore. Sometimes that's enough. But as Theodore drove home to his daughter, he wondered if truth would be enough when facing an enemy who had already proven willing to hurt a child to get what he wanted. The attack came 3 days later, swift and brutal. Theodore was having breakfast with Violet when his phone began buzzing incessantly. Text messages from colleagues, notifications from news alerts, emails from reporters. With growing dread, he opened the first news link. The headline blazed across his screen. Tech mogul's dark secret. Daughter found scavenging for food while father lives in luxury. Below was a photograph of Violet, taken at school without permission, crouched beside a trash bin with her hand reaching toward discarded food. The image was grainy but damning, composed to make her look as pitiful and abandoned as possible. The article painted Theodore as a negligent father who prioritized wealth over his child's well-being, citing anonymous sources who claimed he frequently left Violet alone for weeks with inadequate care. Theodore's hands went numb. This was Damien's counterattack, and it was devastatingly effective. Within hours, the story exploded across media outlets. Social media erupted with condemnation. Hashtags trended calling for Theodore's resignation, for Child Protective Services to intervene, for justice. Protesters gathered outside the company headquarters, holding signs with Violet's photo and demanding accountability. Theodore kept Violet home from school, not wanting her exposed to the cameras that now lingered outside their gates. She seemed smaller somehow, curled on the sofa with her rabbit, watching her father with frightened eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" she whispered. "No, baby. None of this is your fault. People just don't understand the truth yet, but they will." His phone rang. It was Patricia Morrison, the head of the board. Her voice clipped with barely contained fury. "Theodore, we need to discuss your position with the company. This scandal is destroying our stock price and our reputation. The board is calling for your immediate resignation." "I won't resign," Theodore said flatly. "I've done nothing wrong except trust people I shouldn't have. The real criminal is Damien, and I have proof. Proof that's being questioned by his legal team." "Theodore, I want to believe you, but the optics are terrible. We need damage control, and that means separating you from the company until this resolves." After she hung up, Theodore sat in his study, head in his hands. Everything he had built was crumbling. But worse than losing the company was the fear in Violet's eyes. The way she had started apologizing for existing again. Rebecca Hayes called that afternoon. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe you. I've been teaching for 12 years, and I know abuse when I see it. I'm willing to testify to what I witnessed if it helps." Others followed. James, the butler, called offering to provide sworn testimony about Helena's treatment of Violet. The school counselor reached out with documented evidence of Violet's psychological state. Even neighbors who had seen Helena screaming at Violet in the garden came forward. But the most crucial evidence came from Violet herself. Oliver Chen arrived at the house carrying a leather notebook. "Rebecca gave this to me. She said Violet kept a journal for class assignments, and that you should see it." Theodore opened the journal with trembling hands. Page after page contained Violet's shaky handwriting, chronicling her daily life in heartbreaking detail. "Today, Helena said I couldn't eat until I cleaned the whole kitchen. My hands hurt from scrubbing. I miss Daddy. Uncle Damien visited. He told Helena to be harder on me. He said Daddy needs to learn a lesson. I don't understand what that means. I'm so hungry. I found bread in the trash. It wasn't too bad. I wish Mommy was still alive. She would never let anyone hurt me." Each entry was dated, creating an undeniable timeline that corroborated everything Theodore had claimed. Even more damaging to Damien were entries that directly implicated him in the conspiracy. "Uncle Damien gave Helena money today. I heard him say, 'Keep up the pressure. He's almost broken.'" Oliver's eyes were bright with grim satisfaction. "This changes everything. This is evidence of conspiracy, a child abuse, and it's in Violet's own words. No manipulation, no coaching. Just a child's honest account of what she endured. Can we use it without hurting her more?" Theodore asked. "I won't exploit her suffering for my own benefit. We'll present it carefully, with context. A judge needs to see this, Theodore. It's the strongest proof we have." That evening, Damien held a press conference. He stood before cameras looking devastated, his voice thick with emotion as he described his beloved cousin's descent into instability. He claimed Theodore had become paranoid after the divorce, that he was fabricating evidence to deflect from his own negligence. He even suggested that Theodore had staged the abuse to gain sympathy. "My heart breaks for little Violet," Damien said, looking directly into the camera. "She deserves a stable home with someone who will put her needs first. I've consulted with child welfare experts who agree that Theodore's current mental state makes him unfit for custody. I'm prepared to petition the court for guardianship to protect my niece from further harm." Theodore watched the broadcast with growing horror. Damien was trying to take Violet. The realization sent ice through his veins. Oliver immediately filed for an emergency custody hearing, presenting all their evidence to the judge. The hearing was set for the following week, an eternity when every day Violet grew more withdrawn, more convinced that she had somehow caused all this pain. The night before the hearing, Theodore found Violet standing at her bedroom window, staring out at the protesters' distant lights beyond the gates. "Daddy," she said softly, "would it be easier if I went away? If I wasn't here, then Uncle Damien would stop hurting you." Theodore knelt beside her, turning her gently to face him. "Listen to me carefully, Violet. You are the most important thing in my entire life. You are not a burden. You did not cause any of this. Bad people made bad choices, and that is not your fault. I would lose everything, the company, the money, all of it, before I would ever lose you. Do you understand?" Tears rolled down her cheeks. "But everyone hates you because of me. Everyone who matters knows the truth. And tomorrow, we're going to make sure the whole world knows it too. You are brave and strong, and I am so proud to be your father. We're going to get through this together." She fell asleep in his arms that night, and Theodore stayed awake watching over her, preparing himself for the battle ahead. Tomorrow would determine everything. Either truth and justice would prevail, or Damien's manipulation would succeed in tearing his family apart forever. As dawn broke across the city, Theodore dressed carefully and woke Violet gently. They would face this together, father and daughter, ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The courthouse was besieged. News vans lined the streets, reporters jostling for position, cameras tracking every movement. Theodore shielded Violet as they walked up the stone steps, her small hand clutched tightly in his. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly brushed, and carried her worn rabbit for comfort. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Judge Margaret Winters presided, a woman in her late 50s known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce protection of children's rights. Theodore took his seat at the plaintiff's table, with Oliver beside him. Across the aisle sat Damien with his attorney. Looking composed and confident, the proceedings began with Damien's lawyer painting a picture of Theodore as an absent, work-obsessed father who had failed to notice or address his daughter's deteriorating condition. They presented the photograph of Violet at the trash bin, testimony from business associates about Theodore's frequent travel, and character witnesses who described him as emotionally distant and consumed by corporate ambition. Then Damien took the stand. He performed masterfully, his voice catching with emotion as he described his concern for Violet, his attempts to help Helena manage an increasingly difficult situation, and his heartbreak at seeing his cousin spiral into paranoia and blame everyone but himself. "I love that little girl," Damien said, looking directly at the judge. "All I want is to ensure she's safe and cared for. Theodore is a good man, but he's not equipped right now to provide the stability she needs." When it was the defense's turn, Oliver stood and methodically dismantled every argument. He presented financial records proving Damien's embezzlement, emails showing the conspiracy with Helena, and timeline evidence demonstrating that Violet's condition deteriorated precisely during Helena's tenure, not before. Rebecca Hayes testified about Violet's behavior at school, describing how the child had transformed from withdrawn and fearful to gradually more confident once Helena was removed from the home. James, the butler, provided detailed testimony about the abuse he had witnessed, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. Then Oliver presented Violet's journal. The courtroom fell silent as he read selected entries aloud. Each word hung in the air, painting an undeniable picture of systematic abuse and conspiracy. Several people in the gallery were visibly crying. The judge listened intently, her expression growing increasingly severe. Damien's lawyer objected repeatedly, claiming the journal could have been falsified or coerced. But Oliver had brought a handwriting expert who testified that every entry was authentically written by Violet over the course of months, with consistent pressure, spacing, and developmental appropriateness that would be impossible to fake. Finally, Judge Winters called for a recess to interview Violet privately in her chambers. Theodore's heart raced as his daughter disappeared through the door with the judge and a child psychologist. This was the moment everything hinged on. 45 minutes later, they returned. Violet's eyes were red, but she walked with her head up, moving straight to her father's side. Judge Winters resumed her seat, and the entire courtroom held its breath. "I have reviewed all evidence presented," the judge began, her voice carrying absolute authority. "I have examined financial records, witness testimonies, photographic evidence, and most importantly, I have spoken extensively with Violet herself. This is one of the clearest cases of conspiracy, child abuse, and attempted custodial manipulation I have encountered in my career." She turned her gaze to Damien, and it was withering. "Mr. Damien Blackwood, you orchestrated a systematic campaign to psychologically torture a child in order to damage your cousin's reputation and seize control of a company. You conspired with Helena Mitchell to create conditions of abuse and neglect, then documented that abuse to use as ammunition in precisely this kind of legal proceeding. Your actions are unconscionable and criminal." Damien shot to his feet. "This is absurd. I've done nothing but try to protect." "Sit down," the judge commanded. "I am not finished. The court finds overwhelming evidence of your guilt. I am denying your petition for custody entirely. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order preventing you from contacting Theodore or Violet Blackwood for a period of no less than 5 years. Criminal charges will be filed separately, but in this courtroom, you have lost completely." She turned to Theodore, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Blackwood, while I believe you made serious errors in judgment by traveling extensively and not properly vetting your spouse, the evidence shows you have taken immediate and comprehensive action to protect your daughter once you understood the situation. The psychological evaluation indicates Violet feels safe with you and is beginning to heal. Custody remains with you, full and complete. I am also ordering mandatory family therapy to continue supporting Violet's recovery." The gavel struck. The courtroom erupted. Reporters flooded the hallways. Theodore pulled Violet into his arms, and she wrapped herself around him, finally allowing herself to cry tears of relief rather than fear. Damien was escorted out by security, his face contorted with rage, shouting threats that were drowned out by the chaos. Theodore barely noticed. All that mattered was the weight of his daughter in his arms, safe in his. Outside, they faced the cameras one final time. Theodore made a brief statement, his voice strong and clear. "Today, truth and justice prevailed. My daughter suffered terribly at the hands of people I trusted, and that is something I will carry with me forever. But from this moment forward, her safety and happiness are my only priorities. We ask for privacy as we begin to heal as a family." The months that followed were not easy. Damien was arrested and charged with multiple counts of embezzlement and conspiracy. Helena, located in another state, faced charges of child abuse and received a significant prison sentence. The company underwent restructuring, with Theodore implementing new oversight measures and scaling back his own role to ensure he could be present for Violet. Therapy sessions became routine. Violet worked with Dr. Miriam Foster, compassionate psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma. Slowly, painfully, Violet began to process what had happened to her. There were setbacks, nights when the nightmares returned, moments when she tested whether Theodore would really stay, but there were victories too. The first time she laughed freely at dinner, the day she brought home a perfect score on a math test and beamed with pride. The morning she crawled into bed beside him and whispered, "I love you, Daddy," without the hesitation that had colored her words for so long. 1 year after the trial, Theodore established the Violet Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting children who had experienced abuse. The foundation provided therapy, legal assistance, and emergency housing for families in crisis. Violet, now 9, helped design the foundation's logo, a butterfly emerging from darkness into light. At the foundation's opening ceremony, Theodore stood before a crowd of donors, advocates, and survivors. Beside him stood Violet, no longer the terrified child who had knelt in garbage, but a strong young girl finding her voice. Theodore had prepared a speech, but when the moment came, he set his notes aside and simply told the truth. A year ago, I almost lost everything that mattered because I was not paying attention. I let work consume me. I trusted the wrong people. I failed to see my daughter's suffering until it was almost too late. I will carry that guilt forever, but I will also carry the lesson. Nothing in this world is more important than the safety and love of the people who depend on us. He looked down at Violet, who smiled up at him. This foundation exists because of my daughter's courage. She survived cruelty and manipulation, and she found the strength to tell the truth when it mattered most. If we can help even one child find that same courage, if we can support one family in crisis, then something good will have come from the darkness we endured. The crowd applauded. Violet stepped forward to the microphone, and the room fell silent. I used to be really scared all the time, she said, her voice small but steady. I thought nobody cared about me, but I was wrong. My dad cares. My teacher cared. Lots of people cared. I just couldn't see it then. If you're scared right now, if bad things are happening, I want you to know that there are people who will help. You just have to find the courage to ask. And it's okay to be scared. I'm still scared sometimes, but I'm also brave. Now, and you can be brave too. The applause was thunderous. Theodore knelt beside Violet and hugged her tightly, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, strong and alive and free. That evening, they returned home to a house that finally felt like a home again. They made dinner together, Violet standing on a stool to help stir the pasta sauce, chattering about her day at school and the new friend she had made. They ate at the kitchen table, the same kitchen where Theodore had once found her covered in garbage. But that room held no power over them anymore. After dinner, they sat in the garden as fireflies emerged in the gathering dusk. Violet leaned against her father's shoulder, her rabbit tucked under her arm. "Daddy?" she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you came home that night. I'm glad you didn't leave again." Theodore kissed the top of her head. "I will never leave you again. That's a promise I will keep for the rest of my life." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and trusting in a way that had once seemed impossible to reclaim. "I know," she said simply, and in that moment, Theodore understood that they had both survived something that could have destroyed them. They had faced betrayal, cruelty, and the darkest parts of human nature, but they had also discovered that love, when fierce and unwavering, was stronger than any darkness. The road ahead would have challenges. Healing was not linear, and shadows would sometimes creep back, but they would face everything together, father and daughter, bound by a trust that had been tested and proven unbreakable. As stars emerged above them, and Violet's breathing softened into sleep against his chest, Theodore made one final silent vow, to never again take for granted the precious, fragile gift of the child in his arms, and to spend every remaining day proving that she was, and always would be, the greatest triumph of his life.